Hey everyone, thanks for joining today for this presentation on migrating and modernizing to achieve your business goals. My name is Gareth Bowers and I'm the CEO of Silicon Overdrive. Today we will be discussing Silicon Overdrive and our partnership. In the main body of the presentation, I will discuss migration and modernizing, including best practices. And finally, I will give you a glimpse into some customer case studies and how we can assist you in the future. Silicon Overdrive has over 25 years as an IT company, where we assist clients with a range of services, including security, migration, and managed services. We have also been awarded the Public Sector Partner of the Year for Sub-Saharan Africa for 2021 and the AWS Consulting Partner of the Year for 2020. The great thing about our AWS competencies and partner programs is that it helps our customers who can then access various AWS funding programs, among other benefits. I have put up on the screen some of our AWS certifications. If you would like some more information, you can refer to our website or contact us. And on to the body of migration and modernization. What is modernization? Modernization is a term used to indicate that you are refactoring or replacing or improving the application, typically taking advantage of cloud-native services or changing your way of architecting the application. This normally should be coming with realized benefits in terms of cost savings over comparable infrastructure and easier ways of managing the infrastructure and therefore reducing the load on your support team. It should also be increasing agility in delivering new features. Here is a lovely illustration of how you can improve your TCO or total cost of ownership by implementing additional managed services. On the left, you can see that the cost for on-premise versus lift and shift is often normally the same. So that means that the cost of running a same-sized workload on-premise and in the cloud is often comparable. Over time, what you're wanting to achieve with modernizing that workload is by looking at ways of right-sizing the instance or looking for the smallest possible size to run the workload and then possibly take advantage of elasticity or auto-scaling. You're wanting to use optimized EC2s. You're wanting to look for how to decouple your workload so that you can separate the components and by so doing, achieve more granular control of the different components, and therefore you're only paying for those components running in auto scaling or additional capacity when required. Further down on the right, you will then achieve greater cost savings as you move towards serverless or managed services, and those can be achieved by removing those sort of undifferentiated heavy lifting or the effective time that it takes your team to achieve something, which can be achieved with a cloud native service. So if you were to look at something like AWS's RDS, the database and the handling of the synchronization and the backups and the automation compared to having one of your staff look after it and ensure the backups are always running, and if something goes wrong, fixing it and setting that up will normally always be higher than the cost. This is a great slide showing the complexity of the considerations of a workload as to whether it can be migrated or not, and whether it can be modernized or not. So if we look at the various options or the R's, you would have, for instance, if the workload isn't going to be migrated, it can be retained. If it doesn't need to be migrated, or if it's no longer actually being used, it can be retired. If you are then doing a simple migration, that could be, for instance, a relocate or a rehost, which would be largely a lift and shift or just a move. And again, the tools to do that would be different to, say, if you were doing a replatform or a refactor. In a replatform, you would also then possibly be looking at changing, say, for instance, your .NET to .NET Core code, and therefore changing your operating system from Windows to Linux. Or for repurchasing, you could then be looking at, say, for instance, moving your on-premise accounting system to a cloud-based SaaS product, as opposed to rather doing a lift and shift and running your accounting package in the cloud, for instance. You might find that there are certain products where there are already things out there that just make more sense to rather go that model than moving it. The most complicated one would be the refactoring, and that requires a redesign of the application and the infrastructure architecture. This is where you normally want to look at these cloud native services and how you can take advantage of that. The easiest way to do that is by decoupling or by separating the components, which would be a consideration if, for instance, you had a monolithic or a large server, say, running a web application, which maybe had an API level or not with a database. So it could be a 2-tier or a 3-tier application. And if you were to, say, re-architect this in a way utilizing the well-architected principles and looking at reliability, you would be wanting to put the tiers in their own auto-scaling group. So for instance, if you were to split it into a 3-tier, you might have an auto-scaling group for the web tier, then another auto-scaling group for the API tier, each with their own load balancer, and then move the database to an RDS so that each of the tiers can self-heal and look after themselves. And in so doing, you've decoupled it. The benefits of that sort of refactoring would be that you can then do better monitoring of each layer, and wherever the workload is struggling, would be able to allocate additional resources, and you can then monitor that from a support and maintenance perspective. That could also be refactoring to move components into Lambda or serverless, and therefore you could offload certain of the tasks as opposed to adding additional features to it. Another element of refactoring could also be moving to microservices, possibly hosted in containers, or looking at ECS or EKS or even Fargate, and therefore obtain a lot of the benefits of running a very different sort of architecture to what you would traditionally have had on-prem. Let us look at some of the reasons why customers are migrating and modernizing their workload. Firstly, I think the COVID pandemic has greatly changed how a lot of people work and see things. A lot of the considerations over refreshing hardware and looking at end-of-life hardware has opened a lot more doors to considering cloud where previously they wouldn't have. It's forced a lot of teams to look at staff productivity and agility in terms of where services are being run, how staff are connecting into those workloads. Are you running a VPN from all devices connecting in, or is it an easier option to rather look at moving it off the on-prem solution to a cloud solution, and possibly then refactoring it to take advantage of security or cloud native services? And then how does it scale? How do you monitor it? How does it get managed? And that speaks to all sorts of workloads, whether they're web services, IoT, ML, things like that. There's a huge set of considerations around that, but they all speak to the operational resilience and that ability to scale securely. As mentioned in the TCO slide, cost reduction is also a key consideration when comparing the refresh cycle for on-premise hardware, and the best options need to be considered as a total of the solution in terms of what you can modernize and what the workload is doing, as well as what can be improved. Here is an example of the different options for modernizing, with an example for Windows applications specifically. So if we look at the relocate or rehost, that could include moving your workload to a cloud infrastructure, possibly running the application on an EC2 and even having SQL on EC2. You can also run SQL Server on RDS, which would fall under the self-serve or managed options. You could re-platform the application, and that could be to containerize it. You can run that container on either ECS or EKS, and that has got a much faster migration plan, simply because you don't have to make code changes and it supports application portability. You could refactor the application. Some of the key benefits here would be the savings of the license costs in the cloud, as well as potentially performance improvement and cross-platform support. So typically you would do this by converting your .NET application to run .NET Core. This can then run on, for instance, instead of a Windows EC2, you could run it on a Lambda even, if you wanted to go serverless. And you can also then do the same for your database, in as much as if you wanted to refactor your database, you could convert your SQL Server into possibly something like Aurora or DynamoDB or Neptune or Redshift. What is interesting to note is that even the stored procedures in your SQL Server, assuming you've got business logic contained in there, can be converted as well and modernized. Onto the migration and modernization customer journey and how that can look in practical terms. The migration journey is divided into 3 phases: the assess, the mobilize, and then the actual migration or modernization. The assess phase can consist of a rapid discovery or a set of tools that can run on premise. And the reason for that is largely to really get an in-depth understanding of some of the workloads and whether there are weekly or monthly tasks or processes that run that require a lot more resources. These then can be discussed and considered as to whether, for instance, these can be moved into a separate task or have some other way to offload them, rather than provisioning hardware that is only being used for a fraction of the time. So for instance, if we consider that there's maybe a month-end run that generates invoices and sends them out to customers or things like that, rather look at offloading that to a separate process than your traditional sort of application server running a scheduled task or a cron job, and then rather have that spin up a service, run the process, and then shut itself down. So you could find that, for instance, your base workload could run on a half or a quarter of the resources, and then you only pay for the other resources to run that task for maybe, say, 4 or 6 hours of the month when it's needed to spin up and run, and then it can shut itself down. Those are the sort of considerations that make cloud computing a lot more flexible and powerful than traditional on-premise provisioning of hardware. Also in the assess phase are things like running workshops and immersion days to really give people a sense of what can be done and what is possible in the cloud, and understanding a lot of the services, and then possibly also running POCs or proof of concepts to confirm if there is specific concerns around a workload as to how that could run for a specific customer. The mobilize phase is then the beginnings of actually migrating or moving the workload. And this would normally be setting up the business case and the base infrastructure for how the workloads will integrate and how they will be sharing resources. So for instance, you would want a business case, a migration plan, a landing zone could be used with a control tower if there's going to be multiple workloads, possibly each workload with a production and a staging or dev account and how those link together, and therefore possibly a shared log account or backup account, and those sort of considerations. So as soon as you start looking at more than one workload and potentially 2 or 3 accounts per workload, these things need to be just discussed and considered kind of carefully, as well as then looking at the security and compliance across the account and how people are accessing it. That is typically handled through the business case with the center of excellence and the customer's IT team or support team understanding and advising around the workloads as to where their priorities or specific considerations are. Then the actual migration and modernization would then be the execution of the migration plan for each workload. So these can often run in parallel if there are multiple, and there can be dependencies, as you might find that this workload can only run once the database or the other parts from another workload have been put in place, and all of those sort of considerations. Again, the modernization component here will typically be the most involved and often take the longest, simply because it will normally involve development cycles and depend on the development team. Converting to Lambda or serverless or microservices and cloud native is a great opportunity for the team to improve the workload and possibly address certain things that have been on the roadmap or the wish list for some time, but simply nobody's gotten around to implementing it in the current workload. Let us have a look at some migration best practices. There is a range of best practices, and these evolve over time. However, some of the ones that we specifically wanted to highlight is the customer's executive team. There needs to be a strong alignment with them and their understanding of that workload and how things need to be enacted and in what order. After all, whilst we as a partner can assist, the customers knows the workload intimately. The timelines assigned for deliverables need to have goals and actions, and those need to be tracked, and the collaborators need to be aligned in regular meetings so that any blockers or delays can be highlighted and discussed. The best practice security and potentially guardrails and looking at things around security and accounts and restricting access needs to be very carefully considered, simply due to people possibly being in different countries or different locations, and how you can mitigate risk and how people are deploying the project, if there is CI/CD or code pipelines, if there's certain services that people don't need and you want to implement least privilege concepts, and how you go about all those considerations and where it is managed from. The other best practice we strongly recommend is defining the business success metrics. And by that, I mean defining that if the workload runs on AWS, how is it determined from the business as to whether it is a success? Is it running faster than it was on premise? Is it running at a lower cost point? Is it easier to manage? Is it being more secure? Is it allowing the team to be more scalable? Those sort of metrics can differ depending on the pain points experienced, as well as what the business is trying to achieve or where their market is. So what is the AWS WellArchitected Framework Review, and how can it assist you and your workloads? The AWS WellArchitected Framework was put together by AWS over several years from working with customers and seeing their pain points and putting together best practices to assist people, effectively providing guardrails or tools and mechanisms to ask questions as to whether things had been considered and if the workload was at the right point for certain other considerations. The framework itself is based on 6 pillars with over 50 questions between them. And they often ask the same thing, but from slightly different perspectives to try and establish whether or not things can be improved. From my side, the most important pillar is the operational excellence as it aligns business with IT with the developers. The key things from my side is looking at whether somebody has considered governance and compliance and defined what is actually meant to be happening with things like logs and backups and retentions, and where those things are stored and who should be accessing them, and therefore providing a set of IT policies or IS policies that make it easier for the engineer or the programmer to confirm whether things have been implemented according to how business is expecting. So this is particularly important if you consider team scaling or adding new people to the team. It makes it a lot easier to ensure that people have a structure in terms of how business is wanting those things defined. It makes it easier from our side as a partner to review that what's been implemented in an account has been implemented according to the policy. And from a business perspective, it makes it easier to validate what is in the document so that if they need to do a review or have an audit, then it becomes a central point of truth. The other pillars like security, reliability, performance efficiency, cost optimization, and sustainability all address those exact same concerns from their own points of view. So for instance, security might be asking, have you implemented logging? Have you implemented monitoring? Have you got services like possibly AWS config and AWS guard duty, possibly even a WAF or a web application firewall, which those services could be coming at a slight cost, and therefore looking at cost optimization to ensure that how it is implemented as well and optimal as can be. Similarly, looking at things like reliability would be looking at, have you right-sized your servers or have you implemented the lowest configuration so that you don't have, for instance, over-provisioned hardware, which is only being used a fraction of the time. So it's really about understanding the workload, when is it being used and how can it scale. So this would also speak to possibly refactoring certain components or decoupling them to provide better insights into the granularity of the components in terms of what can be improved around it. Performance efficiency and reliability are very much looking at no single points of failure and just making sure that they are running as optimally as can be. So why use the framework? Well, as mentioned, the framework really helps open up conversations, and doing things like running benchmarks and testing systems at production can really highlight if there have been assumptions made when architecting the workload that actually don't work well in practice. So an example would be, say, for instance, you've got a workload that, let's say you've suddenly got a lot of users suddenly hitting the site. Maybe you're running an advert, or there's certain things that might be causing people to suddenly hit the site. You might find that your amount of users hitting it don't allow the auto scaling to kick in. So maybe you would need a method to decouple that, or have a queuing mechanism, or rather use Lambda. But you might find Lambda has a soft limit on how many Lambda functions can run simultaneously. So again, you might find that at scale, your current architecture doesn't actually work or will fall over. So the well-architected framework is really useful at kind of allowing a lot of those discussions from the different pillars to just see what has been done, what has not been done, and where can there be additional tests and experimentation done to improve it. Another key thing to highlight from the well-architected framework is evolution and allowing somebody time to play with new architectures, to play with new security services. These things constantly change over time, and the sort of security required today is different from the attack vectors that people were seeing 2, 3, 4 years ago. Same with coding paradigms and architectures, and the sheer nature of cloud supports a lot of options that wouldn't have been available on premise or at a lot of traditional ISPs. And therefore, you can take advantage of a lot of services with increased advantages. So it is important to have those considerations when reviewing the architectures. It would be remiss to talk about migrating and modernizing on AWS without discussing the funding programs. AWS recognizes that a normal migration will take a period of time, and during that time, you will often incur double costs at both providers. To offset that, AWS provides usage credits and also partner credits to assist with the migration if approved. These can take the form of POA funding for SMBs or AWS startup funding. And as you can see, there are a range of programs or options there for startups. For the assess phase, before the mobilize phase, there are tools which can be used to do the license and optimization assessment, or the OLA, which is used for the tooling to do that on-prem discovery that I mentioned. There are also programs that can assist with the migration of Windows workloads specifically that give additional credits, which is the WRMP and the WMP funding. There is also specifically for that, the WMP funding for the modernization program for the Windows is a great way to assist teams modernize their workload and allows us as a partner to actually assist with that modernization or development as well. Then lastly, as indicated on the well-architected slide, there are $5,000 per review done by an approved or a partner part of the well-architected program. Now I would like to discuss 3 customer case studies where we have helped customers migrate and modernize their workloads. The customers' names have been anonymized, so we will just be talking about their industry. The first customer is an online retailer that sells designer brands predominantly through flash events and sales. During the well-architected review, it was identified that the solution could not scale quick enough to handle these spikes in traffic. This is a common problem when running a workload on EC2 with auto-scaling, in that it takes several minutes for the new service to register as healthy. In addition, several security recommendations were also highlighted in the review. The proposed solution was to re-architect and deploy to a new environment with best practice security and improved reliability rather than improve the current environment. By conducting the review, we removed single points of failure, improved reliability, and used additional AWS security services and improved their security posture. This is an example of a re-platform modernization. Customer 2 is a cryptocurrency investment fintech that has a mobile app and allows its users to invest and trade using an e-wallet of various cryptocurrencies. The problem was that since the customer deals with cryptocurrency and processes card payments, they were required to achieve PCI DSS compliance to ensure security of the data. Upon assessment, we found that their current environment deviated from best practices and compliance standards. So it was decided that the best solution to become PCI DSS compliant would be to re-architect and rebuild and migrate their workloads to a secure and compliant environment. As such, to meet their compliance requirements, we re-architected and deployed the environment with a focus on security and automation. AWS CDK was used for infrastructure as code so that changes could be versioned and deployed on demand. AWS config was used to simplify security analysis, change management, and compliance auditing, which reduced operational overheads on their team and time required for, and thus reduced the cost of their compliance audit. By utilizing DevOps methodologies, the customer was able to achieve PCI DSS within 5 months after engaging with our DevOps team. This is an example of a re-platform and refactor modernization, as they did move some of these services to Lambda. The third example is an online academy. It's a digital online school offering curriculum-based courses that, due to its video consumption and subscription model, required a custom LMS that would meet their specific requirements and subscription model. In addition, they needed it to be highly available, resilient, secure, compliant, and scalable. Using the principles of the WellArchitected Framework, we architected a best practice, secure, and compliant solution that is highly available and scalable. Our team developed and deployed the custom LMS platform faster than what would have been traditionally possible. The infrastructure as code was done via Terraform, and the application enhancements via the CI/CD pipeline can be deployed rapidly and risk-free to ensure the availability of this service for these students. A very high POPIA and GDPR compliance score were achieved, ensuring the students' information security. This is an example of a modernization. Lastly, I would like to highlight how you can engage with us and take advantage of this offer, where we are offering a 1-hour free consultation, which can be used for things like clarifying technical questions, advice on architectures, discussing AWS funding options, discussing migrations or POCs, or discussing running a free well-architected review. Here are the contact details for our business development team. Please reach out to Ross Davey or Ilse van Tonde if you'd like to schedule a 1-hour free consultation for any of the services listed on the screen. Thank you very much for your time today, and I trust you found it informative and hopefully learned a few things, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks.